In this lesson, we're going to learn how to create class constructors. Class constructors are necessary to properly create objects of a class. The term we use for that is instantiate, because when we create a object, we're actually creating an instance of an object. So we call that process instantiation. A constructor is a method that has the same name as the class itself. So for example, if I want to create what's called a default constructor, and what that means is that the constructor will initialize all of its data members to their default values, then all I do is create the constructor public time with open close parentheses, because we don't have any arguments to a default constructor, along with the body, which simply assigns 0 to each data member, hour, minute, and second. To use that constructor, I use it in code like I just typed in, time, the time, and assign it new time. New is the keyword that calls the constructor, and the compiler goes and finds a match for the default constructor and initializes the time accordingly. So that's one example of what we call a default constructor. Another example is what we call a fully parameterized constructor, and that's one where there is a parameter for each data member, and then we simply assign the data members to the associated value coming in from the parameter, or in the case of the method call, the arguments themselves. Here is where we could work with constraints, and we're going to work on that later in the course. But for example, right here where I have hour equals h, I could very easily test to make sure that the hour is not greater than 23. Just like with minute, I could make sure that minute, and for that matter second, are not greater than 59, because once you get to 60 on either minute or second, then you flipped over to the next increment. Either with 60 seconds you've added a minute, or with 60 minutes you've added another hour. So this is the place where you can start validating data. I'm not going to do it here just because it takes away from the main emphasis of this lecture, which is on creating constructors. But you'll get an opportunity later to actually work with what we'll call data validation. Also notice that I have created two constructors with the same name. Time, the default constructor, and time, the fully parameterized constructor. In this case, you can do this because of something called method overloading, which is a technique or a technology that Java allows. Overloading allows you to create methods with the same name as long as the parameter list varies in some way. So notice with the default constructor, I have an empty parameter list. With the fully parameterized constructor, I have 3 parameters. I could create yet another constructor like this. Oops. And that's perfectly legal because, again, my parameter list is different in that this time I only have 2 parameters. I can even go one farther. Let's just say minutes, or minute, and have a 4th constructor with just 1 parameter. And that's perfectly fine when the compiler, when the compiler looks at all the different instantiations of an object it can tell the difference, and it will call the appropriate constructor for the call itself. So like in this second example, we get the fully parameterized constructor. In the next one, we get the constructor with 2 parameters. And then the last one, we get the constructor with 1 parameter. So that pretty much covers the gamut of how to create constructors. Of course, based on the type of class that you're building, your constructor can have all sorts of different kind of code. The important thing to understand is that you need to have constructor definitions in your class definition. You just have to. And also that you can overload them so that you can have different constructors that take different arguments or have a different number of parameters based on what type of object you want to create or instantiate at the time that the constructor is called. So that wraps up this lesson on constructors, and we're going to move on to the next lesson where I'm going to show you how to create what are called accessor methods, or also sometimes called getter and setter methods.